Welcome everyone to WLT on the craft of writing personal essays with Krys Belc and Melissa Faliveno. My name's Sam Batbiak. I'm the program director for the Writers League, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. But before we get started, I'm going to introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Krys Belc. Krys Belc is the author of The Natural Mother of the Child, a memoir of non-binary parenthood, named one of the best LGBT books of the year by Harper's Bazaar and an NPR. Books We Love Pick. And In Transit, a chapbook of flash nonfiction. Krys is the memoir editor of Split Lip magazine. He lives in Philadelphia with his partner and their 4 young children. Welcome, Krys. And next up, we have Melissa Faliveno is the author of the essay collection Tomboyland, named a Best Book of 2020 by NPR, New York Public Library, Oprah Magazine, and Electric Literature, and recipient of a 2021 award for Outstanding Literary Achievement from the Wisconsin Library Association. Her work has appeared in Esquire, Paris Review, Bitch, Lit Hub, and Brooklyn Rail, among others. Received a notable selection in Best American Essays and appears in the anthology Sex and the Single Woman, 24 Writers Reimagined, Helen Gurley Brown's cult classic. The former senior editor of Poets and Writers magazine, she has taught creative writing at Kenyon College, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Sarah Lawrence College, where she earned an MFA. She is an assistant professor of English at Denison University and on the MFA faculty at Vermont College of Fine Arts. Welcome, Melissa. All right. So today we're talking about personal essays. That is a big topic. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the craft and memory and all of those things. But I want to start this conversation by asking each of you how you personally relate to the topic. So how did you come to the personal essay form, and why is it the form that you've chosen to tell your stories in? And I'll start with you, Krys.
Sure. All right. Thanks for the intro, Sam, and thanks for having me. I'm so excited to talk to Melissa. We have done one event like this before, but it was like quite some time ago. So I'm really excited for this. So I started out writing, I think like a lot of writers in a different genre. I was a fiction writer first, and I went to graduate school for fiction writing. I had like always written stuff like in high school and college for funsies. I didn't study English or writing. And then I became a high school teacher, and then I was an elementary school teacher, and then I was like, I got to get out of here. So I applied to graduate school with the one polished short story that I had, because I was going to be a short story writer. And when I was at a program, I was very lucky to be at a program where people were writing a lot of hybrid work, and we were encouraged to take stuff in other genres. And my advisor suggested that I would probably like creative nonfiction, and I didn't know what that was. I'd read memoirs and stuff, but I had never heard that creative nonfiction existed or any of that. And I signed up for a class, and I started writing mostly flash essays, and then I started playing with large essays made of small essays, which I think of as my kind of like subspecialty in the genre. And I'm still working in the large essay made from small essays format, like mostly. So yeah, I'm like always like, you don't need an MFA. Nobody needs an MFA to write. You don't need anyone to tell you to write. I personally would still be writing like horrible Alice Munro ripoff 20-page short stories if I did not go to an MFA. So that's where I started.
Thank you. Melissa.
Yeah. So similarly, I went to college and thought I was going to be a high school English teacher. And then I had to take a math class, and I, quickly changed course, and was taking creative writing classes, and similarly thought I was I wrote poetry, and looking back, I wrote really bad poetry. But I was taking these fiction and poetry classes in college, and like, whatever, like feeling like I was okay, but it wasn't calling me. And then, a professor similarly said, like, have you thought about creative nonfiction? I too had never heard of this genre. Took a workshop, and it was like my brain exploded. I was just like in love immediately with what we were reading, and what we were writing. And I just felt really excited by the prospect of like telling a story from our own experience and making it art. And it never stopped being totally interesting and totally compelling to me. And I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. And it kind of clicked really fast, and then I never stopped doing it. And then also did an MFA a few years later. I took some time off, which was probably really good for me. But then went to a graduate program in nonfiction, and kind of never looked back. Although I am sort of returning to fiction a little bit now. We can talk more about that later, but like I feel like that's sort of a response to writing something deeply personal, sort of having fun in fiction again. But it's a very similar process for me.
Awesome. Thank you. And I love what you said about sort of having that drive to tell your story and kind of turn it into art. I think personal essayists across the board probably feel that way. And so I want to look at the actual essay itself and sort of the process of writing an essay. And I'm wondering where you begin with essays. Like, what is usually the spark of an idea for you? And yeah, so Krys, I'll come back to you.
I think it varies a lot for me. But I think the thing that is the same across the types of essays that I'm writing is that I have like a theme or something I've been reading a lot about and thinking a lot about, and I want to write about it. And I almost think about it as like, that's the mannequin. And then I try on a lot of different outfits on it, right? Like I'll be like, well, what if it's like a straightforward essay where like I pitch it to a magazine and time makes sense and it has paragraphs and uses quotation marks and all that. And then I'm like, I don't know, maybe I don't want to do it that way. What if it was like, an essay with picture? What if it's a photo essay? What if it's an essay with a really experimental timeline? So I think like what stays the same is like, I'm interested in writing about like, let's say like my daughter's experience doing speech therapy, or my experience watching my daughter go through speech therapy. And then I'm like, I got to try on all the different outfits until I find the right one. So it starts usually like with just playing around. And then I figure if I need to read stuff or I need to go do something or talk to other people, like that comes later.
Thank you. Melissa.
I love the idea of trying on outfits. That's like such a great analogy to this process. I think it's kind of similar for me. Sometimes I'll be sort of like compelled by an experience, a very specific experience, or a memory, or an anecdote, or something, or a scene that's just like I keep returning to, something that's kind of obsessing me. And if I can't get it out of my head for long enough, then I know like that means I should write about it. I kind of have to write about it. I think it's the way I make sense of things. And often that kind of whatever it is, that inciting thing comes from a question or something I'm grappling with. I very much write from like the center of a question, something that I'm trying to figure out. And so my essays sort of formally become these very long, meandering things, which are kind of also trying on different outfits, like it's very associative for me. So I start in one place and then I allow my memory and my modes of thinking to take me in whatever directions I'll go. And then I follow it. But it usually starts with that one kind of inciting question or central question, something that I'm very much kind of like in the middle of thinking about or questioning, or something is changing. I like movement or indecision or indecisiveness or uncertainty, I guess.
Thank you. And I love what you're both saying about your different ways into an essay and how maybe it comes from playing around with structure or it comes from asking a certain question. But I think at the foundation of writing personal essays is the fact that you are writing from memory, from your personal experiences. And so, Melissa, I love what you said in your author's note of Tomboyland, and you're talking about how memory is that most fallible and unreliable of narrators. And so I'd love to spend some time with the both of you just looking at memory and the considerations writers really need to be thinking about when writing from it. And so I think we can kind of start just really broadly with just the idea of like our memories and truth. Because I think we think of essays and nonfiction and we're assuming that what we're reading is the truth. But if it's coming from our memories, it's going to be subjective. It might be that we are unreliable narrators and our truth might not be the same truth as maybe someone else's. And so I'm wondering how you conceptualize truth in your essays and what you're kind of striving for when you're writing from your memories. And Melissa, I'll stick with you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I feel like I return to all the time, especially with my students who are undergrads and they're really kind of anxious about this, like what happens when I can't remember, and I think back about this time that I want to write about, and I just don't remember what happened or how it happened or the details of what happened. And the more I write essays, the more I sort of look at that as less a problem and more a kind of like liberation. And it's kind of exciting to me to write, to kind of focus on the things that we don't remember as much, if not more, than what we do remember, because I think there's a lot to be learned in what we can't recall and how we remember something versus like how someone else remembers something, like the way that stories can change from one sort of person to another. And so I think like what's important for me, and what I always try to keep in mind is this idea of like sticking to the truth insofar as like it feels, it's often referred to as like emotional truth, like something that feels really true, something that like I know that this is right in my body somehow, which is less like fact and more like this feels true to me. And then like leaning into those uncertain places and saying on the page, I don't remember, I don't know how this went, like, and allowing your narrative self to be a little speculative. Maybe this happened, maybe this happened, and allowing for that meandering through possibility as opposed to like, it went down like this, XYZ happened and this is the fact. Because like, maybe you have a photographic memory and that's awesome. And, you can write from those spaces, but I think for most of us, we're all writing from these kind of like murky spaces of memory. And so naming what you don't know and naming what you don't remember, or like the slipperiness of a memory can be really fun and can I think actually feel more true on the page. Like if I'm reading a piece of creative nonfiction and the author admits to what they don't know and admits to what they don't remember and digs into that space of uncertainty, that feels more true to me than someone who's like, when I was 6 years old, this happened, and then they like recite dialogue. And I'm like, well, like we could talk more and more about that, but I want to give it over to Krys too.
I totally agree with what you were just talking about. And I've had a lot of these conversations with students too. Like I mostly teach in the community, and a lot of people are coming to the genre and want to talk about like truth. And I'm not like a memoir truther. So I just, it's hard because it's like almost hard for me to sometimes get invested in these questions because it's not what I'm reading for particularly. But I always like kind of joke that the wildest memoir of all is Angela's Ashes, right? Like there's like a spectrum of how much like the author controls like the reader experience and what's happening and the level of like lockdown the memories have. Some of the most like kind of old school, narrative arc type memoirs have this like wild amount of just like dialogue, colors people are wearing, descriptions of outfits. I'm like, it's been 60 years since this happened.
Yes.
How is this possible? But I still vibe with it and have a great time. Like that's fine. But then that's not real, but people think that because it's photorealistic and how it reads, that means it's more real than something that is like a little bit more like associative or has like a can't quite pin it down quality, which is actually how memory works. So yeah, I don't have like I think of the truth as more of like a diving board than like something that's holding me back. It's kind of like I remember what I remember, and I do verify if something's like a fact that is like research, right? I read a lot, and that stuff's important to me. And also, like if I'm talking about the year something happened and someone can help me verify it, I'm like texting my brothers and sisters, being like, anyone remember when so and so, went to the hospital for a concussion or something like that. But in terms of like how the experience of being a person in the world affects me, I'm not gonna get into like spending my time worrying so much that everything is absolutely true. Like I want to admit to the fact that I don't have a steel trap mind.
Thank you for that. I think a lot of writers can really get caught up in the things that they don't remember, and whether or not like the color of a person's shirt was red or blue, but at the end of the day, like we are reaching for that emotional truth more than anything else. And so I'd love to talk about when you're actually in the writing process and you are writing from memories. And so, especially when you're writing about your childhood or maybe experiences that are more difficult for you to remember, how do you tap into your memories? Like, how do you crystallize them so that you can write about them? And Krys, I'll stick with you.
I use photographs a lot. I'm a huge like family archiver for myself, and my parents had a similar impulse. So I just have a lot of like ephemera of things that happened to me. And I am not sentimental about like keeping like letters from crushes or things like that kind of stuff. No, but photos, I never get rid of them. Because I feel like they can really like bring you to a somewhere. So that helps me a lot with memory, with like deciding what to write. I'll almost use them as like prompts sometimes, or like, write against the photograph, like, oh, it's a picture of me smiling on the beach as a child, but I actually don't like the beach that much. So I'm going to write about like the tension inherent in that. So that's like how I tend to access memory. And I'm also really interested because I write a lot about family life. And I grew up in a very large family where like memory gets so distorted based on who is the one, right? Because everybody's like the main character of their own memories. So people are like really personalizing some of these experiences that we all had. And I'm like, wow, we all sit around talking about the same thing that happened when we were kids. Like we have totally different takes about it, and so I'm interested in just like shooting the shit with people and being like, let me like, go home and kind of write down not like what they said, but like what I'm thinking about in terms of how other people access memory and how that's like different from me. And I'm really interested in writers who use like things like pop culture, news stories, right? Like that stuff can also be extremely generative, like remembering what was going on in the culture or world when you had a memory can really like lead you down a cool writing path.
Yeah,
Liz?
I love the pop culture prompt. That's like become one of my favorite essay prompts because it like if you task someone with writing about like a song that they loved when they were 17, which I think is just a really great prompt. Like you inevitably end up writing about like all the other things that were happening to you at 17, and you start to locate all of these specific kind of like memories, specific or maybe kind of composite memories about listening to that song, like where you were, what you were doing, what you were thinking about or crying over, or whatever. So I think that's a really great point of entry, the pop culture reference. Anybody who's not familiar with March Xmas, I'm just going to do a plug for that. It's like a whole annual tournament of essays about songs, and it's so much like memory and nostalgia writing. Oh man, it's so good. It's like my favorite thing. But for me, I do like to do that, but then also I use photos a lot. I am a sort of obsessive keeper of ephemera, which I am like currently very aware of because I just moved and I have like 2 giant bankers boxes marked like memories, which is like so, it's just like letters and, photos and all sorts of weird trinkets. And I find those very like, if I dig through that, something is usually unlodged. So I do like ephemera. If you're feeling really brave, old journal entries, sometimes that's a terrible idea though, but I do that sometimes, for better or worse. Sometimes to fact check myself, like if I'm writing about an experience and I'm like, did I really feel that way? I'll like turn to an old journal and be like, yep, turns out I was feeling that way. And then the other thing that I find really useful is place itself. So like, we might talk a little bit more about this, but I write from place and about place a lot. And so if I'm writing about a specific place or about myself, in a specific place at a specific time, I like to return to that space and go there and be there and sort of immerse myself in it. Whether it's like the town I grew up in, my childhood bedroom, which I still have access to, or like something else, a city or a restaurant or whatever. I wrote an essay in my collection about softball, and that started by like going to the softball field in my hometown where I played softball when I was in high school, and it was just like all of these things just sort of poured out when I was like on the sand, like on the field. So those tactile, sensory memories that you might not have thought of for, decades in my case, like it's just like, for me, the sensory kind of often unlocks a lot of memories too.
Thank you. That's all super helpful. So I think when we're talking about memories, like clearly we all have a lifetime of memories and experiences that we could potentially turn into essays. And I think for some people that can be really overwhelming. Like, how do I choose what I'm going to write about? And so I'm wondering how you approach this in your own writing, and how do you know if you'll be able to make something meaningful to your readers, or is that something that you kind of figure out later on? And Melissa?
Oh man. Krys, do you want to start? It's a hard question.
No, I think I can start. I probably would be. No, I don't want to start.
Okay. So the heart of the question being like, how do you choose the like which memories to write about? I think that, so when I'm drafting an essay, again, I write really long. So like often my essays are like these like 8 to 10,000 word beasts. And when I'm first in the drafting process, I really do try to allow myself to like follow those associations like I was talking about before. So I might start with a specific memory, one very like vivid specific memory. And then inevitably, the more time I spend in that memory, another memory comes. And so I allow myself to follow that path and go to that memory. And then inevitably another memory appears and I go to that memory. And so it's really important to my process to just follow that, even if I'm just like, where are we going? I have no idea why we're here. Which is often part of the process. I'm confused and I don't know why we are where we are, but we're going there. We're just like on this ride and it is carrying us, us being, the royal us. But then like inevitably at the end of the drafting process, I have this like huge, messy, unwieldy thing that is kind of often grappling with a ton of different memories that are all kind of connected to this one central question or idea. So the essay making really happens in the revision process, and this like mess of memory and association and analysis of whatever I have going on, research maybe, starts to take a shape in that revision process. And what I often do is that kind of reverse outline. So then I'll go through with and I'll look at it. Sometimes I'll print it out, lay it all out on the floor, on the wall, whatever space I have access to, and kind of create like a diagram of like all of the things I'm doing, all of the places I'm going, all of the different kind of memories I'm working around. And in that process of sort of diagramming, I can sort of locate like, well, this is maybe a little too peripheral. This one doesn't, it's not doing anything new. It's not like progressing this in any way, or it's kind of going over previous territory, that another memory kind of already navigated. So then I can start cutting them down. But it's really in that revision process that I can start to figure out like which of these memories, which of these experiences or anecdotes are doing something, or propelling the story forward. And that's really what I always return to. Is this doing something new? Is this pushing the essay forward? Is it complicating things in an interesting way? And if I can look at it and it's not doing any of those things, then I'll probably cut it. But the initial process is really just like letting it all come. It's kind of frightening.
I mean, that's a really good reminder, though, because we should lean into the mess and we should follow the threads where, our writing is taking us, and not be afraid of, all of those things that are coming out. And then in the revision process is where we can do more of that work to stand it all down.
Yes.
What about you?
It's so interesting because I feel like Melissa's 10,000 word essays are like the kind of the opposite in a lot of ways of like what my finished product ends up looking like. So I kind of I'm approaching it like almost like if we like met in the middle, we would have like very pretty 4,000 word essays that like
that all of like the major publications want.
Yes, like the right length. I'm like, no, I know it's on one page, but you should just still look at it, So a lot of the writing that I produce ends up being like very like high thread count, I would say. Like there's one page, but like lots of different like timelines and themes and ideas and memories are like kind of all like colliding on one page. So I would say that my first drafts are overly dense and confusing. They would be confusing if you weren't me. I think like part of growing into myself as an essayist has been like accepting the ways in which I'm not neurotypical, and my mind really ping pongs a lot and does not like have the same ability to like rank memories and ideas in terms of their importance that other people have and value. Like I definitely like have ADHD, and like I hold on to really little things and let go of really big things sometimes. So sometimes like, choosing memories means that there's this like supremacy of certain kinds of experiences. And I don't know that I particularly think that, especially because I'm working on this whole like long project about like domestic life, which is mostly drudgery. So I'm talking a lot to say that like, in the beginning, it's very like dense and boxy. And then I kind of like, I think of it as like putting a bicycle pump into the essay and like pumping air into it, like letting myself like sit in a scene a little longer or sit in a moment a little longer. And it's so when I teach, I'm always like, we need to sit here for longer, because I see when people have this impulse to like look away or move on to the next thing. A lot of times I'm like, I'm bored, so I got to move on. And I'm like, no, just like write a good sentence. Like you can do, just sit there, you got it. But I have this like, I'm bored again, like jumping all around. And then I need to like, I also lay things out, but it's like to see like where I need to put another memory, another moment, another interaction with that person, because then I'll like actually like limit the number of things that are allowed to happen on one page in an essay to like, give myself these revision prompts that allow for things to have like a little bit more growth and space. I would say it's like not easy to write like book length works when you're always like, like, and we expect prose works to be like a certain length. especially in this country, it seems like. So yeah, I have the opposite thing where I'm like, I mean, I'm also like, you know, everything goes in, but then I'm like, but I kind of want it to stay in, but also it makes no sense. So I need to figure out like how it's supposed to make sense.
Yeah, there's like such a cool divergence too of like in process of like expansion versus compression. And Krys, I feel like your essays are like a master class in starting in this one very specific place or scene and like and somehow managing to hold all of this other stuff and like these other memories and maybe like I don't know if you like think about like composite memory, but there's this feeling of like the composite experience. Like there's an essay of yours that I have taught that I think was in Brevity, and it's like taking the train into New York. I forgot the title of it. Sorry, but it's great. It's so good.
I also forgot the title of it. It's a long title.
It's a long title. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's like there's this like very kind of specific, there are two very specific scenes in that, like it's a brevity piece, so it's like 750 words or less. And there are these two very specific moments that I can conjure just thinking about it. But there's also this feeling of composite memory around it, where like if you take a train and commute in a city ever, that experience becomes this kind of composite memory. Like maybe there is one day that you remember specifically because something happened that day, but your life is filled with these days of commuting. And so like it has this kind of feeling of that composite amorphous. That's it. Thank you, Casey. That composite experience of memory, which is, I think, how memory works for a lot of people, that it isn't always just this one specific thing. It is this kind of composite of memories that took place in this one location or during this time in your life. So it's like awesome and fascinating to me, this like being able to compress all of that into the very short form, because mine are just like, yeah.
I love it though, because I'm like, she's really saying stuff here. Like she has like a handle on what it all means. That's the part that I'm like, maybe the reader will tell me what it means at the end. You know, like I do feel like it has this like, your work has this quality of like searching, but also there's a finding that I feel like you have like really good endings. And I'm often like, well, that was that. Like when I'm doing my own writing, you know? And I don't know, your work reminds me a lot of like Melissa Febos's work, where it's like, it does have diversions and it does like use different memories and research, and you're on like this really long journey, but then like it does have like a rubber band or spring back effect where you're like, and I know why I was on the journey and in the end, which is like a really nice, it's just like such a satisfying reader experience, which I think is sometimes hard to do in a shorter form.
Well, thank you. Wow, that's really I'm very touched. And like it's amazing that it feels like there's an ending, because I'm always like, I don't know, you take it. Like you all read this and make sense of it, or like may this help you also, you know, on your own journey of questioning something.
Not an ending like Angela's Ashes, like you know, like an ending like, yeah, I'm like thinking about this stuff is hard and I still don't know exactly what I think about it, but thank you for being with me while I did.
Yeah.
You both so much. I love so much of what you're saying about how you kind of wrangle all of these things into the shape of an essay. And that can look very different depending on what you're writing about or the kind of writer that you are. And I think this all kind of naturally led us to talking about structure in essays and form. And, you know, the essay can look like so many different ways. You know, there are so many different ways to write an essay, and it is a really experimental form and it's really exciting. And I think that's part of what also makes it really hard to write. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little more to finding structure for your essays and trying to kind of put together all of this research and memory and experience and obsessions into one coherent piece. And I'll come back to you, Krys, because Your memoir and essays is so wonderful and so cool. And the way that you use photos as frameworks, the way that you use official documents as frameworks was fascinating to me. So can you talk about that process?
I think with writing that book in particular, I specifically was thinking about like what happens to you when you look at someone else's like family album, right? There's like all this context that you don't have, and you're only getting like some of the stuff and it's curated, but the person who makes it, especially if it's like one of those like go to Michael's and get all the scrapbooking stuff and like really go in on it, like I'm so fascinated by that. And like, I think that a lot of I came up as like a parent and then a writer when like mom blogging was a really big thing. And I'm very fascinated by it as like as now it's like almost like a relic because things have moved on to Instagram or whatever. But I'm interested in this idea of like, seeing what's shown to you as a reader and then like having to figure out like what the person who's compiling it is trying to say about their life. So that I had like a specific experience in mind when I was like writing the book, and I think that helped me figure out, like I would always be like, how long can a reader tolerate like whatever the gimmick or thing was. I know it's like taboo to say that you're using gimmicks, but like I kind of do. So like, how long do I think a reader could reasonably like tolerate this form and stick with it and be engaged and get something out of it before I need to like move on to the next thing, which has become really challenging because I think that the book that I've been working on for like kind of a long time now is actually turning into like a book length essay. So the complete opposite of that, where you're like, how can I create some sort of reader experience that is gonna have a sameness to it. I'm like challenging myself to live in that world for now. But yeah, that's how I think about structure. I'm like, what's gonna service the experience that I am having myself when I'm thinking, and that the reader can like experience it with me. So I think, having like photos that don't illustrate, but rather like inspired the work, like directly in the work. And I've written essays that are like in the form of like a research paper, right? Because you're like, not because like that's cool and fun, but because that's the experience I was having as a writer and a thinker when I was making it. And sometimes I do that stuff and I'm like, this feels like a bad homework. Like it feels like I did it because the teacher said it would be so fun if you wrote an essay in the form of whatever. And I just take the good sentences out and chuck the form. But the form in the end, I think, should be like in service of a specific experience that you want the reader to have.
I love that so much. Thank you. Melissa.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think form can just be such a great tool to serve the story and to like and exactly what Krys said, this sort of like part of the experience. And that to me is one of the most exciting things about an essay, that it can take on so many different forms. And the experience of reading those different forms is like radically different, if you read a piece of flash that's all one sentence versus you read a really long sort of meandering essay versus like a hermit crab essay, that takes the shape of something else. It's all very different. It can do so many different things. But I do agree that like the structure should be intentional somehow, it should serve the story and the experience somehow. I think about structure less when I'm in the sort of initial drafting process, and then much more so when I'm in the revision process. In my book, Tomboyland, it felt really right to me to write like mostly braided essays, because I was often kind of grappling with like multiple threads of questioning or subject matter, or like types of content. So like personal narrative versus like research versus reportage, right? So some of my essays have all three of those kinds of modes working at the same time. So it felt really right and true to me that it would be braided, meaning like I've got a chunk of the personal, a chunk of the reported, a chunk of the research. And we're sort of like weaving or braiding between those three or more, or whatever, however many threads that I'm working with, hopefully such that when a reader is, sitting down and reading these essays, they kind of experience that what I was experiencing when I was writing it, which is that kind of associative connection making between these threads. I want the reader to kind of feel that movement that I felt when I was writing or revising. So I don't know if I'll always return to the braided essay. It does seem to be the form that I am like most drawn to. I like having, I guess I like juggling multiple things at once. And I, love a metaphor. So it seems to serve that really well. But I've recently been more interested in and challenging myself to write Flash, which is something that I've tried in the past, and sort of like I just like I'll have this sort of container and be like, but I have so much more to say, and then it then becomes a 4,000 plus word essay. But I'm having a really fun time writing Flash right now, and I think like maybe also this is a response to writing these really long essays that feel kind of unwieldy to me, and I've had only like shorter pockets of time in my life this past year. It's just had so much going on that I feel like I can focus on this like capsule of an essay a little bit more than I can on something that's super long and unwieldy. So that's been really fun.
Yeah. And Krys, I'd actually love to ask you about your Flash nonfiction, because I've also heard you say that some of the essays in The Natural Mother of the Child were actually taken from like different Flash pieces that you kind of put together to create a longer essay. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, if you look in the acknowledgments of the book, there's like 50 million journals, and there's only 6 sections of the book. And like everyone's like, it's a memoir. And memoir and essays, that's like, it's got a porous line to it for me. Whatever will make people buy it. That's what they can call it. That's fine. No, but yeah, I published a lot of Flash because I feel like that's my home as a writer, and what I'm good at, what I like, how my brain works. But I did realize, I had this experience of like starting a project in a program, or starting to write essays seriously in a program, and you like write an essay and you turn it in for workshop, and maybe it's good and turns into something better when you revise, and maybe it's no good and it's something you did because you're in a program and you're trying to learn how to write, and that's really hard. And people should talk more about all the trash that you write in your life that just taught you to be a better writer and never turned into anything, because I have a lot of that. But like a lot. But I realized like I had this experience of I took a break from like taking nonfiction workshops at some point, and I was just like, I'm going to take a lit class, and I'm going to take another genre, poetry class, whatever. I'm going to do other stuff because I'm stuck. And I went back to taking a nonfiction class, and I handed in an essay, and I had this like moment of being like, writing about the same things again. Like, wow, I'm really just like playing the hits, like I just keep writing about like this one thing. And then it's like, I think that's called writing a book, because a book is when you write about one thing for a really long time. Because I was like, well, how many Flash essays can I possibly write about like weird things my mom said to me? And then I'm like, well, I could just turn them all into like one essay. That would be one idea. So that's how I kind of like came to that idea that, I'm writing good prose, and editors and my peers seem to think it's okay, and like I'm into it. And like, is there a way to create like a pastiche of pieces? Like, not everything that you write is going to make it into anything, but like I think that there's a lot of similarities among some of the things that I'm writing, and how can they work together. And that served a really interesting purpose as almost like I read Matt Bell's book about writing a novel, where he talks about having like islands, which are like the scenes that anchor, they're like key scenes, and you should write those, and then you got to write all the junk in between, right? You got to get your characters or whatever to them. So I was like, wow, a lot of these like Flash essays that I do really like, and I'm really drawn to the ideas in them, those can be the islands, and I can make longer essays or sustained thoughts by just getting I didn't have that vocabulary at the time, but that's what I kind of tried to do. And some of the portions of the book were also like, like Melissa was talking, I think it's important also when form mirrors what's happening in your life. So like I have a kind of busy home life and sometimes lots of things are going on. And I would sometimes give myself assignments, and it was easier to be like, you're going to write. I remember being like, you have winter break, and my partner was working 7 nights in a row, but I was like, you haven't written a new essay in so long. Every night for those 7 nights, you're going to write one flash essay about, and it was like a word from the dictionary that was first published in 1987. And like a lot of it was junk, but I did end up eventually like turning that into a real essay. So some of the like, stuff is just like prompts. Oh, someone in the chat said flash essay. It's just short essays. So different people define it differently. I've seen up to 1250 as a cap, which I think it's nonsense. Nothing that's 1249 words is a flash essay. I'm sorry. Typically it's defined as 1,000 or fewer words, but I think most of the great ones are 750 or fewer words. So, all right, I've been talking a lot about flash essay, and I'm going to stop now.
Thank you.
Sometimes used interchangeably with the term micro essay. It's kind of same thing. I just want to second, and I also in the chat seconded the shout out to Matt Bell's book, Refuse to be Done. It's so good. It's so helpful. Even if you're not writing a novel, it's all about revision and the revision process. And there are these like very applicable tips and exercises to do. And so especially if you're working on a long work of nonfiction, like a memoir or an essay collection or whatever, a long book of any genre, it just like has some great ways of thinking about revision, and actual tangible modes. I teach from that book now, and I use those exercises myself. So really, really useful resource.
For sure. Thank you. So I want to backtrack just a little bit, because I loved what you were both saying about how the structure and the form of your essays should kind of service the reader's experience and feed into that. And I think it's important to note that at the end of the day, like, we want our readers to walk away with something after reading our essays, whether that's more questions or an answer to a question or insight into something. We want it to mean something. And I think there are a lot of ways that we can do that. And so I want to segue a little bit into point of view, because there is, of course, like, we're reading nonfiction, writers are writing from personal experience. So we think, okay, well, it's always going to be first person narrative. Like, it's going to be it's their story. That's what's in store. But it was clear from reading both of your work, and especially the essays that a lot of the audience has maybe read or not, that we just like put on our website for them to look at. You both use like different ways of either speaking to the reader, playing with point of view. So there's the second person you, which, Krys, you don't really use it as like second person, but more of like speaking to someone. And then there's like the collective we, which you use, Melissa. And so I'd love to hear how the both of you kind of utilize different points of view in your essay writing and what those different points of view offer your storytelling. And so, Melissa, I'll start with you.
Yeah. I love this question. I think there's this I don't know. I remember learning in like college workshops that you should always stick to one point of view, one perspective, and you can never shift from that. You have to choose one. And I think that there's, some wisdom in that, having some consistency in your narrative voice within an essay or within a book is important. So I just want to preface with that. But I also love shifting if it's for a reason. And, within an essay collection, you might have an I, first person essay entirely, and then you might have a you, second person essay. And I just like that variety of form. I like that variety of voice. The you, I find again, maybe this isn't happening much anymore, but when I was in graduate school, it was like the maligned point of view. Like, everybody just sort of poo-pooed the you, and they're like, oh, if you're not Laurie Moore, you can't do the you. And it was like this rule, which is just crap. But it should serve something. And I think that what the you can do is this, like, it feels to me as a reader very intimate, whether it's the direct address, like your writer is writing to somebody, or the you becomes this sort of shadow self of the narrator, or this kind of like hypothetical version of the narrator, or whatever. There's this intimacy to it, in a kind of paradoxical way that like sometimes feels more intimate than the I. But I tend to use different, point of views, or shifts in point of views to do something experiential. And so like that collective we that you mentioned, Sam, I used maybe in a couple essays, but specifically in one essay in my book. And it was really because I used it because I was writing a sort of like an entire lyric essay about kind of that came from composite memories. So there really wasn't, maybe there were a few specific, very, tangible memories that occurred in that essay, but it was a really composite feeling. So it was like I was writing about my childhood and this place I grew up, and I was thinking about all the kids I grew up with, and in the essay, I wanted the essay to have this kind of collective feel to it, like we were this pack of kids running around in the wild, in this place. And the we felt really important to that. It just felt very collective and very communal, and also seemed to kind of speak to that composite experience of memory. Like it might have been one or two of us that was, that were in one specific memory, and then there might have been like a pack of us that were in another memory. But by just using that kind of collective we, I can hold all of these memories and all of these people and all of these places in one space. And then in another essay, I shift into the you, and I think in the same essay, I also shift into the third person. So I go from first to second to third, which is like, I don't know, it's like breaking all the rules, but there are no rules. So, but that was very intentional because I wanted to create distance. So I wanted the reader to experience a sense of like separation, without getting into too many details. Like the example I'm thinking of is I was writing about a pretty traumatic experience that I had when I was young. And I was writing about the experience of disassociation, or like depersonalization. And I wanted the reader to sort of like have that experience of like a version of this narrator on the page sort of separating from itself. And then it sort of separates from itself again. So there's the I, and then there's the you, and then there's the she. So first, second, third, to kind of create this like compounding sense of separation or fracture or distance. So, I hope that it worked, but that's why I used it there.
Thank you. It definitely worked.
Oh, great. So glad.
The essay that we had folks read was The Natural Mother of the Child, but the Flash version. And there is a large section of that where you're using you, and you're speaking to your partner, Anna. And so I'm wondering, and you do that a lot in your memoir as well. It's used many times throughout. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that and where that kind of comes from for you.
Yeah, there's kind of two answers to this. So like on the one hand, there's a really rich tradition of epistolary writing and nonfiction writing, specifically about experiences of marginalization that, like I'm not an innovator in this way. Like James Baldwin did it, Ta-Nehisi Coates did it, Therese Marie Myatt, right? So these are all like, racially marginalized people writing about their experiences, kind of speaking to an intimate other in a way that like has an element of teaching, but also there's like a conviviality to it. So it's like, there's a distance between the two of us because of generation, or we're different races or whatever, but I'm trying to like speak to my experiences by talking to you. So there's like, I'm really fascinated by writing like that. I mean, Kiese Lehman is another person who does it. There's just so much, like some of the most intimate feeling writing I think that I've read is in that mode. So that's like, I'm interested in it because I think it's beautiful. And I'm particularly interested in it as a trans writer because what it allows me to do is not explain things that I don't feel like explaining, right? I have no interest in like, when did I know I was trans? How did I tell my parents I was transition, right? Like the whole, it's just so boring to me, the coming out stories. I think people write beautiful ones. I won't do that. It's not going to be any good. I just know that about myself. So I didn't want to have this like explanation self that would come in, and I wanted to have like a way for editors not to be able to ask for it either, right? Because it's like, well, it's written to my partner, she would obviously know when whatever happened, right? Like you can't, epistolary writing is like a gift, but it's also a constraint because you can't over explain things, because then you're like, this feels weird because like that person was there with you, so why would you be like explaining this, that, and the other to them? So there's that. And that's like why on a high level I do it. Why I do it as like Krys Belc trying to write at 5 a.m. before my kids wake up is because I write the best in that form. And even when I publish things in other points of view, or, revision often involves a POV change for me. Like I think a lot of writers should think about doing that in revision, because writing in first person in the past tense isn't always in the best service of the story. But I write a lot of stuff in one thing and take it out. And I just find that it's easiest for me to write in direct address to various people and then be like, well, now I have the bones of what I'm writing and I can change it to, whatever collective or first person, or I can change the tense. I can whatever I need to do to it, but I have some meat because that's a good generative writing form for me.
Thank you. All right, so I want to touch on one topic that I know a lot of writers who are writing from personal experience worry about. And so you can think of this in a lot of ways. And I think everyone has their own like ethics when it comes to writing about family or loved ones, or including these people in your stories, because ultimately like you're telling your story most of the time. But there are other people involved in them. And so I'm wondering how you have navigated this process and what you take into consideration when you're writing about other people, especially those who maybe are still in your life. And Krys, I'll stick with you for this one. And I want to read just this line because you talk about Samson, your son, a lot in your book. And there's this part where you say, I can't write about myself without writing about you. Is that okay? And he says, it's sort of good and sort of not good. And that piece just really stuck with me. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to this, how you navigate everything.
I don't mean to deflect the question particularly. However, because this gets asked so much, I think of people who write family, memoir, essay, what have you, or about like relationships or whatever. I'm interested in creating a reader experience where they feel like they know a lot more than they actually do. So I've had this conversation with people who have been, like friends of friends, or someone that I know or meet, but they don't like know me. Like we would have a hard time like making conversation over a beer or whatever. And I'm like, oh yeah, I wrote so much about my kids, name 3 things about them. And they're like, not right? Like there's not actually content that gives you like insight into like things that are not really like my business, particularly because what I'm trying to write about is like the experience of being me, and other people are there. So a lot of it is like people saying like weird stuff to me, or like interacting with me in a strange way because like I'm trans and it's somehow like hard to be normal when I'm in a room. And those people kind of told on themselves. So I feel like I can write about them, whether it's my dad or a stranger. I'm sorry, but you acted weird, so I'm going to write about that. But my kids, like now they're at an age where I can be like, I'm writing an essay about whatever. Or like, do you want me to use your name? Do you want me to just say my son? Do you want me to not put it in at all? Like I can give them the options. But when I wrote my book and I'm writing about grown folks, I don't ask. And if I feel like I need to, I just take the person out, honestly. I'm like, well, do I really need to like have this like, acquaintance or old teacher that I'm going to have to like hit up on Facebook or something to use a quote from them. No, I'm just going to cut it or say someone I knew or whatever and like be fine with it. And I think that there's a different ethics if you're writing about different stuff. But for the purposes of my work, I'm like, the main characters either consented by bringing me into this world without my consent. That's their consent, right? Writing about my parents. And my kids, that they were so little when I wrote the book that I was just changing diapers. And I'm like, well, everyone knows that's part of having a baby. So there's really nothing else to say. And then my partner has given me blanket permission to just say whatever I feel like, and she doesn't care. So that's the answer to that.
Thank you. Melissa.
I just love the what you said about parental consent. That's like, I'm gonna remember that going forward. Yeah, so I sort of have two kind of modes when writing about other people that are in my life, and that I care about and that matter to me. Where like if I feel like I'm writing something that feels like important and vital to the story, meaning I can't cut them or really don't want to cut them, but I want to make sure that I'm doing right by them. I will sometimes show a section to them and just say like, is this true? Is this true to your experience? Do you feel okay with this? Often I interview people, so like that process of interviewing people for an essay kind of is a form of consent. So I'll say, I'm going to write this, part of this conversation might show up in an essay, and I get their consent there. And so in those cases, I feel fine. But if I'm, if it's somebody I know really well, and I'm just like, something about this feels like potentially something, I might show it to them. I often, like in the case of my book, I interviewed a bunch of friends and family members for essays that were like trying to get a sort of chorus of voices about one, idea or subject or question. And so I gave them, the people that I interviewed, the option to use a pseudonym or not. If they wanted a pseudonym, I let them choose one, just so like it's like a fun form of participation. They have some agency over their like pseudonymous. I don't know how to say that as an adjective. They're pseudonyms. And then like in terms of people that are in my life and that I don't want to harm, but also I need to like write my truth, that's where it gets really tricky. And we no one is an island, and even if you're writing your own experiences from your own life, chances are other people are involved and have some sort of part in that experience, and so sometimes you have to write about other people to tell that story. And the best advice that I got, oh my God, I was just about to conjure Melissa Febos. Maybe, yes, Bodywork is an excellent craft book. So when I was writing my book, brief story involving Melissa Febos, who's a friend of mine. She was like my first reader on my essay collection. So she knew it really well. And when I was in edits with the publisher, I had this like total crisis moment where I had a section in one of the essays that was very much about a family member. And it felt really, really important to my story. Like the fact of their experience felt really, really important. But as I was working on the revision, as I was getting closer to turning it into my publisher for the final, this is the final draft that they're going to publish, I just started feeling like, I just don't feel comfortable telling this story. And so I called Melissa in a total panic, and I was like, what do I do? Revisions are due in a week and I don't know what to do about this. And she just said, I think if I'm remembering her words verbatim, they stuck with me really, really deeply. She said, try to focus less on, what story is not yours to tell and focus instead on what is yours to tell. And so how can you tell this part of your life, this experience, this version of your story in a way that is yours entirely and not this other person's? So, in that case, it was like, I could focus on my experience, and not reveal details of this person's life, which would have been sort of like, potentially harming them, me, our relationship, other people, which is just like not something I was interested in doing. And I kind of had to ask myself, like, what's more important, the story or this relationship, which is already kind of challenged and complicated, but I don't want to lose it. Like, what's more important? And it was like, well, the relationship is more important. And, then the story. But I did, I was able to then think of these new ways to tell the story that really centered my experience and not that person's. So that has been like my guiding light since then. Like, what is yours to tell? What is not yours to tell? And if you feel like something is not yours to tell, how can you tell it in a way that makes it yours? So
that feels so true to me. And I remember I have not read my whole book since it came out. Like, I read it enough times before it came out, and I moved on in so many ways from some of the things that I wrote about in there. That's why I wrote it. So, but there's this one section that's about my dad, and I would get physically ill whenever I had to read it, but I refused to take it out. And that was the one thing where I dreaded it, and going into the audiobook, I dreaded it every time my editor wanted to talk about it. I was just like, it makes me so ill. And I was like, if it makes me want to vomit, should I publish? Like, my dad's in my life. My parents are still married. I see these people, whatever. And when I was revising it to try to help with some of these feelings, I was like, is it mostly about how I'm a dickhead, or is it mostly about how he's a dickhead? And I want to make myself the main character. And I can't really talk about the ways in which I'm a small angry man in some ways without talking about him, because that's where I learned it from. So I need to have some of it, but I don't need to tell everything that ever happened. I just need to give enough of him to give the information that the essay is trying to give. And it's not a tell-all, right? It's not a celebrity memoir tell-all. It's my memoir about me. So I don't need to tell everything about someone else, just enough so that they get a sense of what I'm talking about, and I can still go to Thanksgiving.
Yeah. Yeah, I think also just that rule of if you're casting somebody as Dick, make sure that you are also looking at your own dickishness. That feels important. That's a good rule of thumb too.
Oh, thank you both so much. And I do want to second, everyone should read Bodywork by Melissa Febos. It is so, so incredible. And she has a whole chapter on this topic, which I loved as well.
Which you can actually read online. It's published at, I think, Kenyon Review. It's called Big Shitty Party.
Yeah, I couldn't think of the name of it.
Yeah, I can find the link. I'll find it and throw it in the chat.
And the best thing about it to me, that essay in particular, is that she talks about mistakes she's made, which I feel like writers don't do enough. I didn't think I needed to do this, but then in retrospect, my book still would have been fine if I had just done it. I should have talked to this person or done that edit, which I think is really useful for readers to have someone who made the mistake, wrote about the mistake. Now we get to read it before we make our own writing mistake.
Totally.
All right. And so thank you both so much. And we're going to move into the Q&A now. So we did gather questions ahead of time. And for those of you who are in the room, please add any lingering questions you have to the Q&A box. And we're going to get to as many as we can. So from the Google form, how do you get the confidence you need to write? And I'll add just that the personal essay can be really vulnerable. And I think you need to be a little brave to be able to tell your stories and have people read them like that. And so, yeah, how do you get the confidence to do it all? Melissa?
Good question. The longer I do this, the more I feel like it's less about confidence and more about a weird compartmentalization that I have that I once I write something, and certainly once I publish it, it's it's separate from me. Um, and I don't know, writing about your life and writing about your experiences and writing creative nonfiction is a really vulnerable experience. And sometimes when you publish things, you can find yourself in a really vulnerable place. And so for me, I do think that over the years of publishing stuff, I've just built up this kind of veil that drops. I put something in the world and then the veil drops and I just don't think about it. And then someone might talk to me about it and I'm like, oh yeah, let's talk about it. And, luckily I haven't had many negative experiences, but they can exist and they do exist. And, I think there's part of you has to not care about how people are going to respond, or have some sort of defense mechanism in place. And I don't know. I just, I don't know. I don't know that I don't think of myself as a very confident person, to be honest. If anything, I'm just constantly second guessing myself. I don't know if something is good. I seek validation all the time. So, I can kind of feel it when I feel like something is working, when I feel like something has really got promise and got an energy. I can kind of tell when it's good, I guess, but I'm constantly, I don't know, just there is a part of me that's well, will people like it, and that never really goes away. But I do think that the not thinking about it, it's not reading Goodreads. I'm just not gonna look at it, and just not pay attention. So for better or worse, it's my Midwestern, I'm just not gonna deal with it.
Thank you. Krys?
I also I think if you asked people who know me, especially in a writing context, they went to school with me, or editor, especially my agent, I'm the biggest weenie in the world. Anyone who actually knows me will definitely back me up on that. But I will say that the way that I keep confident when writing has to do with formal experimentation. I don't write in interesting forms because I'm some kind of renegade. I do it because I'm able to distract myself from what I'm doing with trying to take kernels of truth or information and make them sing on a page, right? It almost is this depersonalization, but not in a negative way where I feel I need to go to therapy and talk about it. Just in this, I want to write an essay that's in whatever form or looks this way or uses this weird thing I read in the news and I need to work it into my own life. I create these assignments for myself and I get really immersed in it. And then I'm forgetting that I'm writing about my body and my sex life and bad memories of childhood and all this other stuff, because I do, if you can't access a place where it's about the writing, that's really hard. So that's why I keep doing it, because I actually do like writing. I don't do it because I want people to like me. That's why I have a family, right? And friends and a community. I try to have some element where I'm doing it because I enjoy doing it, and it's the revision, sending it to editors, waiting for right. There's a lot of stages where it's I'm in a doom spiral, but not when I'm actually writing a fun scene that I wanted to write. I tried to keep that as pristine as I can, even though it's really hard.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think that there's a really great piece of wisdom in that, that separation of you as writer and you as person, the every time we write, we are creating this, even if it's nonfiction, even if it's the truth, even if it's our lives, it is still you are a character on the page, and this is this version of you, and it's not you in the real corporeal world. And I don't know, reminding myself that the self on the page is not, is not composed of all of the things that I am, is just a version of who I am, and or one chapter of who I was, is very comforting to me. That was who I was then, or even this is who I am now, but it's not who I'll be in the future, or this version of me is more complex than that version can ever be. And that
they don't get all of you. They just get what they get. right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes it's hard because especially when people like vibe with your writing, it's like they feel like they have so much of you and that means you've done a really good job. But I'm like, that's really just like the page me. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's not all of me. So you have to have like stuff that's about the you that has nothing, right? Where people don't know that you write or like whatever, like that really helps me
Yeah.
a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Next question. How do you know when your essay is done? Krys?
Um, I don't know. It's too hard. I want to give advice instead of an answer. That's something that works for me a lot is to test run stuff at readings. If you ever get an opportunity, even if you just organize it with like 2 friends or something, and you get an opportunity to read work aloud, that is really meaningful for me. And whenever I'm asked to read, I read some new stuff. Even, people want to hear like the hits or whatever, but I'm like that annoying band who wants to like read from the book that doesn't exist because like that helps me. Like if I hear it and I read my stuff to myself in a room and it's awkward but helpful, but awkward, but like going and seeing like what when do eyebrows raise and like when do people nod, like that's an experience for me that's irreplaceable. So like I Melissa was talking a little bit about like revision and structure and like trying to like figure out how things piece together, and I do all of that too, but in terms of like whether the vibe hits, there's nothing like having people listen. So since so much of my work is short or composed of short things, I read it a lot, and as I revise, I read it and I see that it's changing me and I'm feeling different when I'm reading it. So really the auditory is very helpful for me personally.
It's really great advice. I definitely read things aloud. I tend to shy away from reading new work, but I feel like that's a really good idea and challenge. I don't know. I like kind of subscribe to the Matt Bell model of refusing to be done. I revise and revise and revise, and I could do it forever. Often I have a deadline, and that's when I know that something is done. It's like as done as it's gonna be, because I do know myself, and I know that I will keep revising, forever, unless there's an external deadline. And sometimes if there isn't an external deadline, I'll make one for myself. I'll set an actual deadline, whether it's just like, be done with this draft, you have to be, or there's a magazine I want to submit to, or whatever. To give myself that actual time frame is really helpful. And then, on the sort of more macro level, it's kind of just a feeling like I have banged my head against this wall for a really long time, and it doesn't feel fun anymore. It feels like banging my head against a wall. So kind of when it stops feeling exciting and stops feeling fun, and I start getting frustrated, that's when I'm like, okay, we gotta cut it off. And sometimes that's just like, that could be in like the first round of revisions, and so I put it away and don't look at it for a while. But when I've been, in multiple revision rounds, and I start to feel that, I'm like, I think I get the feeling, and the longer, like anything, the longer you do it, the more you start to recognize and can honor your own process, which is really important. I can recognize in myself when I have hit that wall, and I just feel like I've taken this as far as I can right now, and it's usually like I feel it.
Thank you.
I just want to add one thing I should have said, which is that you can also, it ties into confidence too, get an accountability partner where you don't workshop, right? You just talk about where the project is, but not in the bullshit way that people do, right? Like in Maggie Nelson's Bluettes, she has this line about how she's been talking about writing a book about blue for years, right? Everybody does that. But with someone where you're like, I have 10,000 words of this essay and I'm trying to make it into whatever, and let's talk in 2 weeks and see if I get there, and just get on Zoom with them or to call them on the phone and be like, so did you finish your 3 poems that you said you were going to write? I did not finish my essay, but I'm going to do it because we're talking and now I feel shamed.
Yes, friend shaming, really, really good advice. Like accountability is so important. I totally agree. Like your writing group, your writing friend, whoever it is, like, hound each other.
Thank you. All right, next question. What is the ratio of writing time to revision time?
Ooh. Ooh.
And if you don't have an idea, maybe just like generally, like how many maybe drafts or how much time do you kind of spend?
I definitely revise more than I like. The generative writing is a much smaller fraction than the revising for me. I love revising. I don't actually love generating new material. Sometimes it can be really fun, and when I'm first starting and I'm excited about something, I feel really good about it. But like, it's in the revision that my brain really starts to like fire, and exciting things start happening. So I think I try to make the generative process shorter so that I can get to the revision process. But I'm like a multiple version reviser. I don't start from scratch. I don't do that, but I do, kind of like big, large scale revision and small scale revision. And I'll decide when I'm, in V2 versus V3 versus V18. Usually when something kind of like big or like macro changes, if the structure has changed, if something not like the smaller kind of like editorial changes have happened, but the macro changes, then I'll give it a new version. So I don't know what the ratio would be, but I definitely lean hard into revision.
Thank you. Krys?
I would say rewriting is where I spend most of I am a starter over a lot. I've become more and more of one as time goes on, which is like very inefficient, but like it just makes it so much better. So it's like an addiction, like something that you shouldn't do, but it works. Like using Q-tips or something, right? Like where you're like,
Just can't not.
You're like, someone told me I shouldn't do it, but it's so effective, right? So like I do a lot of rewriting where I use the old one and take sections. I do have a very good memory for what came before. So I'll have like version 1 and version 2, and I'll be like importing version 1 into version 2, but filling it in. So it does, to answer it, it's like 4-to-1 ratio of revision and rewriting to like the original generating, because a lot of my stuff kind of like seeps outwards in all directions from the original draft. So I'm just kind of like really expansion is a big part of my time.
Cool, thank you. So this will probably be our last question for the evening. What do you think about personal essays that include sections of imagined or even fictionalized accounts? Playing with those lines.
I'm here for it. I love it.
That's good. Yeah.
Love it. I think that, I've been really on this jag lately with my students in writing, what we like to call speculative nonfiction. And it's like taking this idea of the speculative, which is a word that's commonly attached to fiction, like, speculative being like science fiction or fantasy or magical realism. But this sort of element of speculation means something different. It's not necessarily like supernatural or, magic or different, sort of worlds or universes, but like kind of going back to this idea of the unknowing and the uncertainty, like letting that imagining be a mode in your nonfiction, I think is super exciting. There's a recommendation that I always go back to, and it's a book of nonfiction, especially if you're into like biography. It's a collection called A Chance Meeting, and it's by the writer Rachel Cohen, and she's a biographer. That's what she does. But she writes about the lives of writers and artists, and then based on her deep research into their lives, she has these sections in this book where she like imagines them together, what they might have been doing. But the key is to use those words like I imagine Elizabeth Bishop on the train to see Marianne Moore, maybe she was writing in her whatever. So there's this room for that kind of like imaginative space. I think that's exciting, and also, again, kind of speaks to how memory and how thinking works.
Krys, anything to add?
No, that's exactly what I like. That's exactly what I think. I think if it says I imagine, I love when writers on the page are grappling with like trying to connect to things or imagine what they were like. And another, recommendation, a book I just revisited because I'm interested in maybe teaching a portion of it. Justin St. Germain's memoir about his mother's murder. Because he wasn't there, right? Like there's this, I think that the subgenre and creative nonfiction of like true crime or crimes that happened to my family or crimes I was peripherally involved in, like the fact of a body and the third Rainbow Girl, this is not a mode that I personally write in a lot, but if you're interested in speculative nonfiction, anything that like explores a crime where the writer wasn't there is like a really good window into the moves that writers make when they write about events they didn't witness but want to understand. So very much recommend this genre. Natasha Trethewey has one, Memorial Drive. There's just a lot of books where people are imagining these sorts of horrific events.
All right. Well, that is it for this evening. Thank you both so much for all of your insights tonight. It was so great talking to you. Thank you to everyone who joined us. We're going to drop the link in the chat box one more time. Definitely go out and buy these wonderful essay collections. Again, there's just so much to learn from them. And yeah, that is it for tonight. Y'all have a good night. And it was great seeing y'all.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Sam.